Her cardigan is torn at the elbows, yet she kneels in a marble foyer glittering with chandeliers. Across from her, a billionaire father paces in silence while his 8-year-old son hasn't spoken a single word since his mother passed away 6 months ago. Tonight, the school board meets to decide if the boy will be taken from his home, unless someone can reach him first. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe so you never miss a story.
Mrs. Miller adjusts her faded cardigan as she walks through the towering gates of the Grant estate. The security guard nods respectfully, though his eyes note her second-hand clothing and decade-old sedan. Gravel crunches beneath her worn shoes as she approaches the mansion that could house 50 families from her neighborhood. "You must be the new teacher," the housekeeper says, opening ornate double doors. "Yes, I'm Helen Miller, here to work with Thomas." "Good luck with that, dear. The boy hasn't said a word to anyone." The marble foyer sparkles with afternoon sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. Mrs. Miller's reflection in the polished floor looks small and plain, but her eyes hold decades of patient determination. She clutches a simple brown leather satchel, scarred from years of carrying hope to children others had given up on. Thomas Grant sits in the corner of the vast living room, surrounded by expensive toys he ignores completely. His dark hair falls across his face like a curtain, hiding the pain that lives behind his 8-year-old eyes. A family portrait on the mantel shows him laughing with his parents before tragedy struck. "Thomas?" Mrs. Miller says gently, approaching slowly. The boy looks up for one brief moment, then quickly turns away. The massive grandfather clock in the hallway chimes 3 times as Mrs. Miller settles onto the Persian rug beside Thomas. Her knees protest against the hard floor, but she moves with gentle patience. The boy clutches a small wooden train, the paint worn smooth from constant handling. "I brought something to show you," Mrs. Miller says softly, opening her leather satchel. Thomas doesn't respond, but his fingers tighten around the toy train. The scent of vanilla candles fills the air, probably lit by staff, trying to make the enormous house feel more like home. Mrs. Miller understands the futile effort. No amount of luxury can heal a broken heart. "This belonged to my son," she continues, pulling out a battered storybook. "He loved trains too." She remembers her own boy, Danny, who passed away unexpectedly from illness when he was Thomas's age. 20 years have passed, but the ache remains fresh in quiet moments. The storybook's pages are yellowed and soft from countless readings at hospital bedsides and in tiny apartment bedrooms. "We have 3 weeks, Thomas's father announces, entering the room with heavy footsteps. "3 weeks for what, Mr. Grant?" Mrs. Miller asks. "The school board wants him in a residential facility, unless he shows significant progress." Thomas drops his wooden train, and it rolls under the massive oak coffee table. Mr. Grant retrieves the wooden train, his expensive suit contrasting with the humble toy. He kneels awkwardly beside his son, clearly wanting to connect, but uncertain how to bridge the silence that separates them. The train's red paint has faded to pink in places where small fingers have held it tight. "Thomas made this with his mother," Mr. Grant explains quietly to Mrs. Miller. "It was their last project together." "It's beautiful," Mrs. Miller says, examining the simple wooden car. "She must have been very patient. Sarah was everything I'm not with children. Gentle, understanding, present." The admission hangs heavy in the air, while afternoon shadows stretch across Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes. Mrs. Miller recognizes the guilt in his voice. She carried similar feelings after Danny passed away unexpectedly, wondering if she could have done something different. "Grief has its own timeline," she says softly. "Children especially need time to process loss." Thomas reaches for his train, and for a moment his fingers brush against his father's hand. Mr. Grant's face lights up with hope, but the boy quickly pulls away, retreating deeper into his shell. "The doctors say he might never speak again," Mr. Grant whispers. "Doctors don't know everything about healing hearts," Mrs. Miller replies. Outside, a car door slams, and unfamiliar voices echo through the foyer. Dr. Carter's authoritative voice fills the marble entryway as he speaks with the housekeeper. His medical bag clicks against the floor with each step, the sound sharp and clinical in the warm family space. Behind him walks a woman in a severe gray suit, carrying a thick folder marked with official seals. "That's the school psychologist," Mr. Grant says, his voice tight with anxiety. "Dr. Carter called her in." Mrs. Miller watches Thomas shrink smaller into the corner, his wooden train pressed against his chest like armor. The boy's instincts tell him these visitors mean separation from everything familiar, even if that familiarity is wrapped in silence and grief. "Mr. Grant," Dr. Carter announces, entering with professional confidence, "I've brought Miss Walker from the district office." "We need to discuss Thomas's educational placement," Miss Walker adds, opening her folder with bureaucratic efficiency. The adults gather around the coffee table while Thomas sits forgotten in his corner. Mrs. Miller notices how the boy's breathing becomes shallow when strangers talk about him as if he's not present. Her own childhood memories surface, being discussed by social workers after her father passed away unexpectedly. "Has there been any verbal communication?" Dr. Carter asks, pulling out assessment forms. "None," Mr. Grant admits reluctantly. Miss Walker makes notes with her expensive pen, each mark seeming to seal Thomas's fate. Her gray suit matches her expression, cold, professional, unmoved by the human cost of institutional decisions. The grandfather clock chimes 4 times, and Thomas suddenly stands up.
Thomas walks slowly toward the adults gathered around the coffee table, his small feet silent on the Persian rug. Dr. Carter looks up from his assessment forms with surprise, while Miss Walker adjusts her wire-rimmed glasses. The boy stops directly in front of Mrs. Miller, still clutching his wooden train. "Well, this is encouraging," Dr. Carter says, reaching for his pen. "Thomas, can you tell us your name?" The boy's face immediately closes off, and he steps backward. Mrs. Miller recognizes the look of a trapped animal preparing to flee. The scent of vanilla candles seems cloying now, unable to mask the clinical tension filling the room. "Don't pressure him," Mrs. Miller says gently. "He'll speak when he's ready." "Mrs. Miller, with respect, time is running short. The board needs measurable progress." "Healing isn't measurable on your timeline." Mr. Grant watches this exchange with growing agitation. His son stands frozen between worlds, the warm safety Mrs. Miller offers and the cold evaluation his circumstances demand. The grandfather clock ticks louder in the silence, marking moments that feel like judgments. "Thomas, can you at least nod if you understand me?" The boy's face turns his back on all of them and runs toward the marble staircase. Thomas's footsteps echo through the mansion's upper hallways as he flees from the adults below. Mrs. Miller follows at a distance, her worn shoes quiet on the thick carpeting. She finds him in what must be his mother's study, surrounded by family photographs and elegant furniture covered in dust sheets. "This was her favorite room," Mr. Grant says, appearing in the doorway behind them. Thomas sits curled in a window seat, staring out at the gardens his mother once tended. In his hands he holds a silk scarf that still carries the faint scent of her perfume. The delicate fabric seems almost alive in the afternoon light filtering through tall windows. "She read to him here every night," Mr. Grant continues, his voice breaking slightly. "Stories about brave knights and magical kingdoms." Mrs. Miller notices a shelf filled with children's books, their spines showing wear from loving hands. Many are the same titles she read to her own son during their precious bedtime hours together. The connection spans worlds of wealth and poverty. All mothers want to fill their children's minds with wonder. "What was her favorite story?" Mrs. Miller asks Thomas directly. The boy's fingers tighten on the silk scarf, but he doesn't respond. However, his eyes drift toward a particular book with a faded blue cover. "The Knight and the Silent Dragon," Mr. Grant whispers, about a dragon who lost his voice protecting others. Footsteps approach from the hallway, and Dr. Carter's voice cuts through the moment. Dr. Carter enters the study with Miss Walker close behind, their professional demeanor unchanged by the intimate family space. Thomas immediately presses closer to the window, the silk scarf wrapped around his fingers like a lifeline. Mrs. Miller positions herself protectively between the boy and the officials.
"We need to complete our assessment," Dr. Carter announces, opening his medical bag. "Hiding won't help Thomas's situation." "He's not hiding," Mrs. Miller corrects firmly. "He's grieving." "Grief shouldn't prevent a child from accessing appropriate educational services," Miss Walker states, consulting her folder. Mr. Grant looks torn between supporting his son's emotional needs and satisfying the system's requirements. His expensive suit suddenly seems like a costume that can't disguise his helplessness in the face of bureaucratic pressure. "What kind of assessment?" Mrs. Miller asks suspiciously. "Cognitive function, behavioral patterns, communication capacity," Dr. Carter lists clinically. "Standard evaluation for special placement." Thomas's breathing becomes rapid and shallow as he overhears their conversation. The silk scarf trembles in his small hands, while his mother's perfume provides the only comfort in an increasingly threatening situation. Mrs. Miller remembers similar assessments from her own childhood, cold questions that reduced human complexity to checkboxes. "He's not ready for testing," she says firmly. "Mrs. Miller, you're not his parent or guardian," Miss Walker reminds her sharply. "But I am," Mr. Grant says suddenly, his voice stronger than it's been all day. The room falls silent, and Thomas looks at his father for the first time since the visitors arrived. Mr. Grant steps forward with newfound determination, his designer shoes silent on the Persian rug. Thomas watches his father with surprise and growing hope, the silk scarf still wound around his small fingers. Mrs. Miller feels the shift in energy as parental instinct finally overcomes social pressure. "My son will not be subjected to invasive testing," Mr. Grant states clearly. "Not today, not until he's ready." "Mr. Grant, the board's deadline," Miss Walker begins. "The board can wait. Thomas comes first." Dr. Carter closes his medical bag with obvious frustration. "You're making a mistake. Early intervention is crucial for selective mutism cases." "This isn't selective mutism," Mrs. Miller interjects. "This is a child processing trauma in their own time." The adults' voices rise with professional disagreement, while Thomas shrinks deeper into the window seat. His mother's silk scarf provides tactile comfort, but the arguing triggers memories of hospital corridors and whispered conversations about his future. "We'll need to report this delay to the district," Mrs. Walker warns, closing her folder with bureaucratic finality. "Report whatever you want," Mr. Grant replies, his voice carrying new strength. "I'm hiring Mrs. Miller privately, full-time." The announcement surprises everyone, including Mrs. Miller herself. Thomas looks up from the window seat with something approaching interest, the first spark of engagement they've seen from him all day. "That's highly irregular," Dr. Carter protests. Outside, a delivery truck honks loudly, and Thomas suddenly moves toward his father.
Thomas takes 3 small steps toward his father, the silk scarf trailing from his fingers like a banner of courage. Mr. Grant kneels to his son's height, hope flooding his face as the distance between them shrinks for the first time in months. Mrs. Miller watches with professional pride and personal emotion. "Hey, buddy," Mr. Grant whispers, extending his hand slowly. "Want to help me walk these people out?" Thomas doesn't speak, but he nods, the first clear communication he's offered anyone since his mother's passing. Dr. Carter and Ms. Walker exchange meaningful glances, noting this small breakthrough in their mental assessments. "We'll be in touch about scheduling," Ms. Walker says, gathering her official papers. "Take your time," Mr. Grant replies, his attention focused entirely on his son. The boy's hand slips into his father's, tentative but trusting. The silk scarf wraps around both their wrists, binding them together with his mother's memory. Mrs. Miller follows as they walk slowly down the marble staircase, a small family unit forming against external pressures. "This is progress," Dr. Carter admits, grudgingly. "But we still need verbal assessment eventually." "When Thomas is ready," Mrs. Miller says firmly, her worn cardigan a stark contrast to the clinical professionals preparing to leave. The front door closes behind the visitors, and Thomas looks up at Mrs. Miller with curious brown eyes. Mrs. Miller opens her leather satchel and removes the worn storybook she mentioned earlier. Thomas eyes the faded cover with interest, while his father watches nervously from nearby. The afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows illuminates dust motes dancing like fairy dust around them. "This story helped my son when he was scared," Mrs. Miller says gently, settling onto the Persian rug.
Thomas sits beside her, still holding his mother's silk scarf, but no longer using it as a shield. Mr. Grant joins them on the floor, his expensive suit incongruous against the casual family moment. The grandfather clock ticks peacefully in the background. "It's about a boy who thought he lost his voice," Mrs. Miller continues, opening to the first page. "But he discovered it was just hiding, waiting for the right moment." The story unfolds with gentle rhythm, her voice soft and patient. Thomas follows along, his finger tracing illustrations of brave children and magical creatures. Mr. Grant listens with equal attention, perhaps hearing these comforting words for the first time in his adult life. "The boy found his voice when he needed to help someone else," Mrs. Miller explains, showing Thomas a colorful drawing. The child looks up at her with recognition, as if understanding a deeper message about courage and purpose. His lips part slightly, and for a moment it seems like words might emerge. "Thomas," his father whispers hopefully. But the boy closes his mouth and looks away just as the doorbell rings urgently. The housekeeper opens the front door to reveal a woman in an elegant navy dress, her silver hair perfectly styled and her jewelry understated but expensive. She carries herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way through social influence rather than official channels. "Grandmother Thompson," Mr. Grant says quickly, rising from the floor. "We weren't expecting you." "Obviously. I heard about today's meeting from Dr. Carter." Thomas immediately retreats behind Mrs. Miller, the silk scarf wrapped protectively around his wrist. The boy recognizes tension in adult voices, a skill learned through months of whispered conversations about his future. Mrs. Miller feels his small body trembling against her back. "Mother, this isn't a good time," Mr. Grant says carefully. "Nonsense. It's the perfect time to discuss Thomas's needs realistically." Grandmother Thompson's gaze settles on Mrs. Miller with obvious assessment. The contrast is stark. Traditional approach, demand results, apply pressure, fix problems through force of will. Mrs. Miller offers something different: patience, acceptance, healing at the child's own pace. The grandfather clock chimes 5 times, marking the end of the official school day, and Thomas tugs Mrs. Miller's sleeve again.
Thomas pulls gently on Mrs. Miller's cardigan sleeve, then points toward the staircase leading to his mother's study. His message is clear without words. He wants to continue their story in the quiet sanctuary where her memory lives strongest. Mrs. Miller nods, understanding, while Grandmother Thompson watches with sharp disapproval. "We're not finished discussing his education," Grandmother Thompson insists, her navy dress rustling with authority. "Actually, we are," Mr. Grant says, finding his parental voice. Mrs. Miller is staying, and Thomas sets the pace. "This is exactly why Sarah worried about you." Grandmother Thompson replies with calculated cruelty, always choosing the path of least resistance. The words hit their target perfectly, and Mr. Grant's newfound confidence wavers. Thomas feels the shift in energy and presses closer to Mrs. Miller, seeking protection from the verbal warfare erupting around him. The silk scarf in his hand trembles with his anxiety. "Don't bring Sarah into this," Mr. Grant says weakly. "Someone has to speak for her memory. She wanted Thomas in the best schools, receiving proper treatment." Mrs. Miller recognizes the manipulation, using a dead woman's wishes as weapons against her living family. Her own mother-in-law had employed similar tactics after Danny passed away unexpectedly, insisting she knew what was best during the darkest period of grief. "Thomas," Mrs. Miller says gently, "shall we go upstairs?" The boy nods eagerly, desperate to escape the adult conflict, but Grandmother Thompson blocks their path. Grandmother Thompson stands firmly in front of the marble staircase, her expensive jewelry catching the afternoon light like armor. Thomas shrinks back against Mrs. Miller's legs, overwhelmed by the confrontation he cannot escape or control. The grandfather clock ticks loudly in the tense silence. "No more coddling," Grandmother Thompson declares. "Thomas needs to face reality." "He's 8 years old," Mrs. Miller responds, her voice steady despite her anger. "He's facing more reality than most adults could handle." "Spare me the amateur psychology. I've raised successful children." Mr. Grant flinches at the implied criticism of his parenting, his earlier confidence completely eroded by his mother's expert manipulation. Thomas watches his father crumble and understands, with childlike clarity, that the adults who should protect him are failing. Thomas, Grandmother Thompson addresses the boy directly. Your mother would be ashamed of this behavior. The cruel words shatter something inside the child. He drops his mother's silk scarf and runs toward the front door, desperate to escape the poisonous atmosphere. Mrs. Miller follows immediately, her worn shoes slipping on the marble floor. "Thomas, wait!" she calls, but the boy is already outside. He runs across the manicured lawn toward the garden maze, his small figure disappearing between tall hedges. The security guard starts after him, but Mrs. Miller waves him back, understanding that pursuit will only frighten the child more. "Now look what you've done," Mr. Grant says to his mother, his voice breaking. The setting sun casts long shadows across the estate, and Thomas's sobs echo from somewhere deep in the maze. Mrs. Miller enters the garden maze with careful steps, following the sound of Thomas's crying through the geometric pathways. The tall hedges block the setting sun, creating a twilight world where a small boy hides from overwhelming pain. She calls his name softly, offering comfort without demanding response. "Thomas, I'm here. You're safe." His sobs guide her through several wrong turns before she finds him curled against a marble fountain at the maze's center. Water trickles peacefully while he clutches his knees to his chest, making himself as small as possible. Mrs. Miller sits nearby, without approaching, giving him space to feel secure. "Grandmother Thompson was wrong," she says quietly. "Your mother would never be ashamed of you." Thomas looks up with tear-streaked cheeks and eyes full of confusion. At 8 years old, he cannot understand why adults hurt each other with words, or why love feels so complicated and painful. The silk scarf lies forgotten back in the house, severing his connection to comfort. "Sometimes grown-ups say terrible things when they're scared," Mrs. Miller continues. "She's scared of losing you too. She wants to send me away," Thomas whispers, his first clear words in 6 months. The admission hangs in the evening air like a prayer answered. Mrs. Miller's heart races with joy and caution, knowing this breakthrough could disappear as quickly as it came. She keeps her voice calm and supportive. "No one is sending you anywhere," she promises. "Your father won't let that happen." Back at the house, raised voices carry across the garden, and Thomas's eyes fill with fresh fear. The angry voices from the mansion grow louder, carrying across the evening air to where Thomas and Mrs. Miller sit beside the fountain. Through the maze's hedges, they can see lights blazing in every window as the argument escalates between Mr. Grant and his mother. "They're fighting about me," Thomas says, his voice small and guilt-ridden. "They're fighting about what's best for you," Mrs. Miller corrects gently. "But it's still my fault." The child's logic breaks her heart. He blames himself for the adult conflicts swirling around his grief. Mrs. Miller recognizes the pattern from her own childhood, when family arguments always seemed connected to her needs and presence. "Thomas, listen to me carefully," she says, moving closer. "None of this is your fault. Adults make their own choices. My mom left because of me too." The words revealed the core of his silence, survivor's guilt that no 8-year-old should carry. Mrs. Miller understands now why therapy failed and why medical intervention felt threatening. Thomas doesn't need professional diagnosis. He needs someone to absolve him of imaginary crimes. "Your mother didn't leave," Mrs. Miller says firmly. "She passed away because she was sick. That had nothing to do with you." Through the hedge walls, car doors slam as Grandmother Thompson prepares to leave. Her departure should bring relief, but Thomas knows she'll return with reinforcements. The fountain's water catches the last sunlight, and Thomas reaches for Mrs. Miller's hand. Thomas's small hand slips into Mrs. Miller's weathered palm as darkness settles over the garden maze. The fountain's gentle trickling provides peaceful background music while they sit together in the growing twilight. Mrs. Miller feels the trust in his grip and understands the responsibility he's placing in her care. "Will you tell me about your boy?" Thomas asks quietly. "The one who had the storybook?" Mrs. Miller's breath catches at the question. She rarely speaks about Danny, even after 20 years of grief and healing. But Thomas's need creates a safe space for sharing pain that connects rather than isolates. "His name was Danny," she began softly. "He loved trains, just like you do." "Did he get sick too?" "Yes, but he wasn't scared because we read stories every night. Stories about brave children who found magic in ordinary things." Thomas nods with understanding beyond his years.
Children who face loss develop wisdom that adults struggle to comprehend. They talk softly as stars appear overhead, two souls recognizing each other across the chasm of shared sorrow. "I miss her voice," Thomas whispers. "She sang to me." "What was her favorite song?" "You Are My Sunshine. She said it was true." Footsteps approach through the maze, and Mr. Grant's voice calls anxiously. "Thomas? Mrs. Miller? Are you in there?" Thomas tightens his grip on her hand, but doesn't try to hide, and his father's relief echoes through the evening air. Mr. Grant navigates the maze with his phone's flashlight, calling their names with growing desperation. When he finally reaches the center fountain, he stops abruptly at the sight of his son sitting peacefully beside Mrs. Miller, their hands joined in quiet companionship. "Thank God you're both safe," he says, sinking onto the marble bench beside them. "We're okay, Dad," Thomas says clearly, the words carrying across the garden like music. Mr. Grant's face transforms with wonder and joy at hearing his son's voice after months of silence. Tears flow freely down his cheeks as he reaches out tentatively, afraid to break the spell with too much enthusiasm. "I heard you," he whispers. "You called me Dad." "I never stopped loving you," Thomas replies with childlike honesty. "I just forgot how to say it." The three of them sit together beside the fountain, surrounded by the maze that once symbolized confusion and loss, but now represents the journey back to connection. Mrs. Miller feels her own healing continuing through this moment of grace and redemption. "Your grandmother won't give up easily," Mr. Grant warns gently. "She thinks she knows what's best." "Then we'll show her what's really best," Thomas says with new determination. "All of us together." Mrs. Miller squeezes his hand supportively as evening stars shine brighter overhead. The fountain's water catches moonlight like scattered diamonds, transforming their humble gathering into something magical. "Are you ready to go inside?" Mr. Grant asks his son. Thomas stands up with decision and begins walking confidently toward the maze's exit. Thomas leads them through the maze's pathways with surprising confidence, as if his mother's memory guides him through the geometric puzzles. Mrs. Miller and Mr. Grant follow closely, their footsteps soft on the garden paths while night settles peacefully around the estate. "How do you know the way so well?" Mr. Grant asks his son. "Mom showed me the secret. Always turn toward the light." Indeed, each correct path leads toward windows blazing in the mansion, while dead ends fade into darkness. The simple wisdom carries deeper meaning about navigating grief and finding hope again. Mrs. Miller smiles at the child's insight. They emerge from the maze to find the housekeeper waiting anxiously by the garden gate, a warm blanket in her arms. "I was so worried," she says, wrapping Thomas in soft wool. "Are you hungry? I kept dinner warm." "Yes, please," Thomas answers politely. "Can Mrs. Miller eat with us?" "Of course, dear." The mansion's lights welcome them home like a beacon of safety and belonging. Mrs. Miller's worn cardigan and faded clothing no longer seem out of place in the elegant surroundings. Thomas's acceptance has transformed her from outsider to family member. "There's something else," Mr. Grant says as they reach the front door. "Mrs. Miller, I want to offer you a permanent position, not just as Thomas's teacher, but as our family's educational coordinator." The generous offer represents security she's never known, steady income, health benefits, professional respect, but more importantly, it means staying with Thomas as he continues healing. "I accept," she says simply, and Thomas cheers with pure joy. 6 months later, Thomas Grant stands at the front of his new classroom, speaking clearly to 20 curious faces. Mrs. Miller watches from the back as her former student, now her teaching assistant, helps younger children who struggle with their own challenges. His transformation seems miraculous to those who knew him during his silent months. "Remember," Thomas tells a shy girl clutching a worn stuffed animal, "sometimes words hide when we're scared, but they always come back when we feel safe." The child nods with understanding, beginning to trust this boy who speaks her emotional language. Mrs. Miller observes the interaction with professional pride and personal satisfaction. Thomas has transformed his pain into purpose. "How did you know he would recover so completely?" Mr. Grant asks, joining her at the back of the classroom. "I didn't know," Mrs. Miller admits.
I just trusted that love and patience could reach him eventually. And you were right. Through the windows, autumn leaves drift past like scattered gold coins. The small private school they've established serves children who need extra understanding, extra time, extra care. Thomas helps interview each prospective student, using his experience to recognize others who've lost their voices to trauma. "Mrs. Miller," Thomas calls from across the room. "Emma wants to know if you have any stories about brave children." She opens her worn leather satchel and removes the same battered storybook that first connected them. "I have exactly what she needs," she replies with a warm smile. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimes noon as children gather for story time, their voices mixing in harmony that speaks of healing, hope, and second chances. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can offer another person is simply believing in their ability to find their voice again, even when the world has given up listening.